Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Stephanie Wiles, and I'm the Henry J. Heinz II Director of the Yale University Art Gallery. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Lydia Winston Malbin's extended family for their generosity in creating the Lydia Winston Malbin Fund. I'd like to especially thank Lydia Robinson, who helped us think about how the legacy of the family's generosity could be expanded to create new opportunities for the research and deep understanding of modern art. To that end, I'm thrilled tonight to introduce Frances Jacobus Parker, the inaugural Lydia Winston Malbin Scholar of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. Trained as a specialist in post-war and contemporary American art, Frances has a particular interest in the work of underrepresented artists, feminism, and museums and public art. Her recent publications, lectures, and exhibitions have covered topics ranging from intergenerational artistic collaboration, women realist painters of the 1960s and 70s, the representation of the Vietnam War, art of the 1990s, and appropriation in recent work by Native artists. Frances has previously held curatorial and research fellowships at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. She's also a teacher, and she's taught at SUNY's Fashion Institute of Technology and the University of Notre Dame. Frances holds her BA in English from Wesleyan University and an MA in Art History from the Courtauld Institute of Art. She's completing her dissertation at Princeton University on the contemporary American artist Via Selmans. Frances's forthcoming article on the collector Lydia Winston Malbin will appear in the 2023-2024 Yale University Art Gallery Bulletin. Welcome, Frances. Before I turn it over to you, I just want to say how great it has been working with you. I admire the research you've done on Lydia Winston Malbin, and it's just been a fantastic partnership, and I look forward to you sharing all of this research with our audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that and for that introduction. And I just want to echo the thanks to Lydia Winston Malbin's family and colleagues, many of whom are in the audience tonight, and some of whom I had the privilege of interviewing. And I hope that my talk offers something new to those of you who knew her well, and also something for those of you who are learning about her for the first time. So just a note about naming, you'll see my subject on the right, Lydia Winston Malbin, and she was born Lydia Kahn. She then married and became Lydia Winston. After the death of her first husband, she married again and became Lydia Winston Malbin. So the collection was known as the Winston Collection and then the Winston Malbin Collection. And I will be referring to Lydia Winston Malbin as Malbin throughout. Lydia Winston Malbin was known in her lifetime as the preeminent collector of futurist art in the United States. She was passionate about the work of the early futurists, the avant-garde movement that emerged in Italy in 1909, determined to do away with the classical past in favor of an embrace of technology, industry, and all things modern. And she was also instrumental in introducing their work to a broader public in the US in the mid-20th century. I'm showing you here a spread from House and Garden magazine from 1986. So Lydia here is 88 or 89. This is just a few years, 3 years before her death. She's pictured in her New York apartment where she moved in 1974. You can see that title, At Home with the Future in New York, Lydia Winston Malbin's futurist art rivals Italy's best, that captures the high regard with which her futurist collection was seen. And you can see some of these masterpieces here. So I'll just gloss a few. We have in the background behind her sculptures by Umberto Boccioni. In the corner, a sculpture by Medardo Rosso, a precursor to Futurism. And then if you move around the corner, you can see we're moving to the bottom picture where we have, again, Boccioni Bala, Severini, another Bala. You may notice too, however, that in amongst these are some decidedly non-futurist works. So again, behind Malbin, we have a Joseph Albers glass painting. In front of her is a Picasso ceramic piece. And then at the bottom image to the right, at the far right, is a painting by Robert Delaunay. And we will continue into other parts of the apartment where you can see this incredible array of additional works, again, futurist pieces mixed in with others. And I won't list, there's too many to list, but the yellow painting we have is painting by Bala. There's a Miro here, Nevelson. We have, moving over here, Victor Vasarely, a sculpture by Bala, a mobile by Alexander Calder. And again, moving into more parts of the apartment, you get even a broader sense. So we're not just looking at futurist works, and in fact, not just at pre-war European works. There's a stela in the background here. You can also see Mondrian, a Leger, a Miro, and so on. So as I hope you're getting a sense, even though I know it's this is a lot to take in quickly, you're hopefully getting a sense just for the breadth and scope of her collection. And really that it did span the major movements of the early 20th century, including Cubism, Constructivism, Dada, and even moving up, as I mentioned, to abstract expressionism, Cobra, and pop art as well. So if the label of futurist collector is inadequate, I would say that also the label of collector is inadequate, for it really fails to account for the vision and scope and the intellectual thrust of Malbin's activities. I'm showing you just here a selection of essays she wrote, addresses, seminars she was involved in. You can see on the far right an address she gave on the occasion of being awarded an honorary doctorate from Wayne State University. You may recognize her co-honoree in the photograph below is Marcel Duchamp, so she was in good company. And she also wrote, as the title of that address indicates, she wrote and spoke thoughtfully about art collecting and her role and responsibility as a collector. She was incredibly committed to sharing her collection with the public. She organized and lent the collection to just an incredible number of exhibitions in the course of her lifetime. This is just a selection of catalogs from exhibitions spanning 1951, which is the earliest catalog on the far left here at Cranbrook, to 1973-74, which is a big show at the Guggenheim consisting of over 250 works organized by Linda Shearer of the collection. Along the bottom, you see also catalogs from many, many graphics exhibitions. And this is something also that was really interesting about Malbin as a collector, is that she collected graphics, so prints, drawings, but also posters, greeting cards, really an expanded notion, as I'll go on to show you, of what a collector might show and collect. And also she really emphasized those in her collection. So as you'll see on the bottom right, documenting a collection, this is an exhibition consisting of files from her archives. And I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time this year really immersed in her archival universe. She left behind an extraordinary archive, and most of it is now at the Beinecke at Yale. And this is what I'm showing you here is really just to give you a sort of brief glimpse of the rigor with which she maintained these files. So you're seeing just a sampling of some documents that are in the artwork file for a single artwork. Julio Gonzalez is The Kiss, which itself contains 267 pages, so huge files for many works of art, containing these catalog cards that you see on the left, letters, provenance documents, photographs of the work, secondary material, and so on. And these files really in their standards, rival and exceed what, current museum standards today. So in addition to more standard artwork documentation, there's really a wealth of more personal and relational material in the archives, photographs of her with friends and colleagues and artists, letters from dealers, statements by artists, and also things like what you see on the bottom right here, which is the front and back of a photograph of a work of art by Antoine Pevsner. But as you can see that it's been signed by him, and he's including information like, about the orientation and the title. So a lot of material that's incredibly valuable, not just about artworks themselves, but about these broader networks. And this is something that really struck me in the archives, is that the archive itself creates a kind of picture of the networks of kinship, influence, and exchange in the mid-20th century art world in the US and Europe. In the last years of her life, with the help of her conservator and archivist, Dana Cranmer, she began compiling the highlights of her archive into a series of volumes, which she called scrapbooks. I'm just showing you one page here. I apologize, it's difficult to see. They're in these glassine folders, so you're getting a lot of reflection. But in a way, she's collaging together highlights from individual acquisitions. You can see here a picture of an artwork she acquired alongside a receipt of sorts for it, alongside photographs of her with the artist. And these scrapbooks were also Xeroxed after her death into a series of bound volumes. And I'll just say, I have them here. I've borrowed them from the family. And when I went to pick up these scrapbooks, I was imagining, a few little volumes, and instead came away with 2 tomes like this. So that gives you just a little bit of sense of the volume and also the interest with which Malbin treated her archive. In amongst the material, I also began to catch glimpses of Malbin herself. And so there are playful photos, as you see here at left and right, of her peeking through works of art in her collection, and also images that really convey the rigor, the scholarly approach she took to her collection. I believe in this picture, she's documenting drawings in her collection. So as I went through this material, I initially thought about it as I do as an art historian, as a kind of research support, right? That will tell me about other things. But as I progressed, I began to think more about what the creation and the maintenance of this archive meant to Malbin. And I really began to think of the archives themselves as a significant aspect of her work as a collector, and indeed her contribution to art history. Her archive was not simply a result of an aptitude or zeal for record keeping, although she certainly demonstrated that, but rather, I think, and as I'll show today, a core demonstration of her philosophy as a collector. In the address I mentioned that she delivered at Wayne State University in 1961, she articulated her philosophy this way: what is the role of a collector of modern art? As I see it, the collector has a very individual place in our form of society, helping to weld a link between the artist and his world. So in this framing together, the artwork and the collector serve as a kind of conduit between the artist and the world beyond. And I think both Malbin's archive and her collection really illustrate and result from this artist-centered relational ethos that guided her approach to art. My title, Extensions of the Artist, is an allusion to that, and it comes from Lydia herself. So on the left, you see a catalog for an exhibition of prints at the Cranmer Art Museum in 1961. And most literally, this phrase, extensions of the artist, refers to an artist's work across media. So for example, Picasso, who we think of as a painter, also made ceramics. So he extended into these other media. But Lydia also thought of it is extending far beyond into posters, greeting cards, and so on. And I'm just showing you an individual example of a poster from Robert Rauschenberg that was once in her collection, and then a greeting card from the curator Willem Sandberg to the Winstons in 1966. So there were a number of exhibitions that showcased this material as well, these so-called extensions of the artist. As I'll discuss today, this phrase, extensions of the artist, I think helps to illuminate what distinguished Malbin's approach to collecting. And I say that both about artwork and archival materials. And I think what makes her so remarkable as a collector. She's pictured here in a Detroit News magazine article from 1984, so just a couple of years before that House and Garden spread we started with. And I like this picture, this series of pictures, especially for the way it captures something more personal and intimate about Malbin and her relation to art. That Malbin would become an art collector was not surprising. She was the daughter of the famed industrial architect Albert Kahn, Detroit-based, famous for his designs of Ford factories and many more. And you can see here just a couple is a design above and a factory below that really take on a very modern approach to space using glass, natural light, ventilation. So she grew up, surrounded in one sense by an incredibly modern architect, but at home things were a little bit more traditional, as she herself has explained. This is the home she grew up with in the Brush Park neighborhood of Detroit, also designed by Albert Kahn. So his residential style was more English Renaissance, prairie. And as was his sense of home decor. So this is Lydia speaking about the environment that she grew up in. She says, I grew up in a home surrounded by classic beauty, ancient forms, restrained color, old pewter, leaded windows, antique French poetry. And she goes on to explain that modernism does creep its way in the form of impressionist painting and some open spaces and large windows, but that's sort of where her father stopped. After completing a bachelor's degree at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York in 1921, Malbin returned home and in 1923 married the attorney Harry Louis Winston, who would become her steadfast partner in collecting. And they really were an incredible team. The couple settled into a home, again, built for them by Kahn in Birmingham, Michigan, outside of Detroit. You can see it has this sort of cottagey aesthetic at the front, but in the back, there are double height ceilings to accommodate her art collection and extensions that were built for studios and for the art collection as it grew. Over the next decade, Malbin became a fixture in the Detroit contemporary art world, joining committees, juries, and juries for local art museums and organizations. Her commitment to understanding the art of her time motivated her own art practice as well. As she put it, quote, I wanted to understand what I saw, and the only way to understand, particularly technically, is to try it yourself. In the 1920s and 30s, she took painting classes at the nearby Cranbrook Academy of Art, and also traveled to New York to study with Yasuo Kuniyoshi and George Gross. She returned in 1939 to Cranbrook for a Master of Fine Arts degree, where she studied with the Finnish-born ceramist Maya Grotell. Through working with clay, Malbin explained, quote, abstract form and space became very real to me. And she was really an accomplished ceramist. She worked with high-fired porcelain and stoneware, and made her own glazes. You can see here dinnerware that she made for a line produced by the Sarin and Swanson Group of Modern Home Furnishings in 1947. So through these art classes and also alongside exhibition catalogs and visits to New York City galleries, she learned about major European art movements and in particular developments in abstraction. Alfred Barr's 1936 Cubism and Abstract Art, whose famous cover you see here, was instrumental in educating her about modern art, and she referred to it as her Bible, an indispensable resource. So she had previously purchased works by local artists, and in 1938 made her first purchase of a work by a non-local artist, by Marc Chagall. This is a gouache, La Fortune et le Jeune Enfant from 1929. And then she was really off and running. She acquired additional works, which I'll talk about a little bit, but she's sort of feeling her way into this wider world of modern art and abstraction. To Malbin's frustration, Detroit art circles were still enamored by traditional realism. So she was determined to introduce the city to developments in modernism, and she spearheaded groundbreaking exhibitions, events, and acquisitions for the art institutions. In 1942, she organized Detroit's first ever exhibition of abstract art, consisting of 30 works borrowed from the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, as the Guggenheim was then called, in consultation with its director, Hilla Rebay. Held at the Detroit Women's City Club, The Art of Tomorrow was, by all accounts, a total flop. In Malbin's words, quote, "This major effort met with little response and generated no follow-up interest. The ladies were uninspired." If the collecting class was not yet ready for modernism, local artists were. The same year, Malbin organized what she called a traveling university, bringing prominent New York artists to Detroit to give talks and offer critiques, and that was a big success. A decade later, in 1952, she organized Abstract Art as Reality, another abstract exhibition showcasing works made by local artists across media and held at the Detroit Artist Market. And as the press clippings indicate here, it was a wild success. Malbin's art practice informed her understanding of art works. It was the relationship she formed with several prominent curators and art dealers that most shaped her sense of what her role as a collector should be. By her own accounts, none were more influential than Alfred Stieglitz. Wandering into his New York gallery in American Place in 1937, looking for work by John Marin, she was, as she later put it, confronted with Stieglitz's rather frightening but intensely humane countenance. And I'm just showing you here two pictures taken by Ansel Adams showing Stieglitz in his gallery around the same time, a little bit later. And one of them includes, as you can see on the left, an exhibition of works by Marin. While she didn't come away with a Marin on that occasion, the budding collector took from Stieglitz a deep sense of her responsibility to the artist and the public. She later recalled, Stieglitz said, "You owe a debt to the artist forevermore. And as time goes on, it's up to you to share that work with the world. It's not yours, it belongs to the artist." End quote. So that's her end quoting, paraphrasing Stieglitz. And then she goes on, "And I've taken that attitude ever since, that a work of art is an extension of the artist. It's part of his spirit. It's part of his creativity and self." You can see here how, in her retelling, Malbin personalizes Stieglitz's concept of stewardship. The artwork not only belongs to the artist, but acts as a kind of proxy for or extension of the artist's self. Malbin also took to heart Stieglitz's warning against using art for financial gain and adopted his idea of the amateur, or his term of the amateur, meaning etymologically someone who does something for love, amour, rather than for money. She maintained a strict policy never to sell or trade, only parting with works when she gave them to family members or museums. For her part, Malbin seems to have made an impression on Stieglitz too. He inscribed with her after their first meeting a copy of Herbert Seligman's Letters of John Marin with the words, "There are very wonderful hours in life, maybe not so many. There has been a very wonderful hour at an American Place this morning." The two went on to exchange letters, mostly about Malbin's wish to acquire a Marin and whether she could afford one. And she did eventually purchase two watercolors, which you can see here, each of which has notes from Stieglitz on the back. Another legendary New York gallerist, Rose Freed, also provided essential education, and as their extensive correspondence attests, became an important interlocutor, supporter, and friend. During visits in the 1940s to Freed's gallery, the Pinacoteca, later the Rose Freed Gallery, Malbin saw firsthand works by many of the artists she had read about. She would go on to purchase more than 30 works from Freed, and you can see the list of those acquisitions on the right and just a small sampling of them on the left. These acquisitions of works by Alexander Archipenko, George Braque, Lissitzky, Piet Mondrian, Francis Picabia, Pablo Picasso, and Kurt Schwitters really trace the major movements charted by Barr's Cubism and abstract art. In 1949, Malbin's growing interest in early futurism was cemented by the exhibition organized by Barr and James Thrall Sobey, 20th Century Italian Art at the Museum of Modern Art. And this really heralded a resurgence of interest in modern Italian art in the United States. You can see installation shots here. The two on the left show you in particular that there was a lot of futurism in this exhibition. And on the right, you can see three guys ogling a Modigliani. So it extended, it was not just futurist work by any means. Lydia and Harry did not see the show, but had the catalog, which importantly included an essay by Barr on early futurism. And I think this really shaped her understanding of early futurism, her interest in the earlier part of the movement in particular. She also began to see that many of the works she'd already collected were, as she put it, poetic expressions of our technical age, and that they had certain resonances with the work of the futurists. She was captivated by futurism's exploration of the effects of motion on states of mind and perception, and saw their work as prophetic of the ways in which technology would shape the 20th century. In 1957, sounding rather like a futurist herself, she wrote, quote, "As we go speeding in automobiles, objects flash by. At night, neon lights form new and complex patterns of color. The earth flattens out when we travel by plane. We can explore the depths of the sea. The education of the eye never ceases." She saw the futurist contribution to later artistic movements as under-recognized. And I'm showing you a detail of Barr's chart again, so you can see that Cubism really sort of dominates the family tree, and futurism is there, but a little bit more sidelined. And in addition to tracing those legacies that he lays out, she was interested in thinking more expansively about how futurism might be a precursor to later movements. More practically, pursuing early futurist works provided the collector with an appealing challenge, and I think this is key, an opportunity. Early futurist works remained scarce in the US market, and many first-rate works were still available, if you could find them, so in the possession of artists or their families in Europe. So the idea of buying directly from artists appealed to Malbin for practical reasons, but also, of course, aligned with this growing interest in knowing artists personally and achieving what she called the total involvement with a work of art. Encouraged by Rose Freed and her friend Alexander Dorner, Lydia and Harry made their first major collecting trip to Europe in 1951, focusing on Paris, Rome, and Milan with the aim of locating early futurist artists and their work. They returned to the United States with their first futurist purchase, an oil on canvas with sequins by Gino Severini, Sea Dancer, Dancer Beside the Sea. And you can see just especially in the center, that sort of network of sequins that create in the light, as if you were able to move around, a sort of secondary additional composition. You can see on the right, the Winston's boarding the ship in France, Harry is carrying the painting. And I love this picture. Of course, it's a great historical document. It's also such, I think, an important reminder of just what collecting looked like in this time. You had to take long journeys by boat. You carried your work back in many cases. There was a lot of legwork that went into this collecting. As importantly as a painting, the Winstons came away having met Severini and befriended him and also his family. And you can see a snapshot taken by Harry Winston during their visit to the family in Meudon in 1951. And they actually had to track Severini down by going first to Meudon outside of Paris, then to Rome, and then back to Meudon again. Over the next decade, Lydia and Harry made regular collecting trips to Europe. While focused on Rome and Paris, they often made pilgrimages elsewhere to track down artists or their families. As determined as they were to find artworks, the relationships they built with artists or their descendants were as important. As Malbin put it in 1951, quote, "To know the personality of those who created the works, to listen to their ideas and try to comprehend their language helps us to understand the artist's relation to his time." This drive to understand artists deeply on a conceptual and personal level shaped both what she collected and how she did it. As you've no doubt gathered by now, the scope of her collection was vast and far too much to go into in the time that I have. So I just want to take you through a few key acquisitions, give you a sense of what that process of collecting looked like and the ways in which it was built on these personal relationships. As I've mentioned before, Malbin left behind a remarkable paper trail, and this really helps to, I think, chart and flesh out what the mechanics of collecting looked like, and also really the routes by which these now canonical artworks made their way from the possession of artists or their family members or other representatives into a prominent American collection. I'm showing you here on the left a note from their friend Claire Gilbert, who was an art world fixture in Paris, who really acted as their chaperone. And here she's writing to them to suggest that in the afternoon they go to visit Tristan Tzara, and then Brancusi, and then Sonia Delaunay. And she writes, after all these geniuses, we poor ordinary people will need to eat if we are not dead through this concentration of values. So they did indeed meet all of these artists, and they made acquisitions from each of them. On the right, you can see a receipt signed by Tzara showing works that they purchased from him by Jean Arp, Max Ernst, Albert Giacometti, Antoine Pevsner, Francis Picabia, and Kurt Schwitter. So quite a haul for that one meeting. And that was acquisitions they made in 1954. This is the work that they purchased from Tzara by Antoine Pevsner, his figure of 1925, a copper sculpture. And I'm showing you the scrapbook page that I showed you initially, again, that sort of puts together all of these elements that went into the acquisition and communicates that relationship that was built with the Pevsners, with Virginie and Antoine. And I know it's hard to see, but there are these personal snapshots at the bottom. They also became close friends with Jean Arp and his second wife, Marguerite Arp. Malbin demonstrated an incredible perseverance and knack for gaining the trust and often friendship of individuals who were reclusive and reluctant to part with works. So Brancusi, notoriously cantankerous, took 5 visits, but did eventually agree to sell them his La Négresse Blonde, which was the first work he sold from his studio in 20 years. He also gave Malbin a series of photographs and a doodle, and I think seems to have generally warmed to them. Through Severini, they were able to contact the surviving family members and other networks related to the early futurists. In Rome, they became friends with the daughters of Giacomo Balla, Luce and Elica. And here too, acquisitions took time, and they took the building of relationships. So the painting on the left, Iridescent Interpenetration, they first saw in an exhibition in Rome, asked if they could purchase it. The sisters said no. And then after about 4 or 5 years of friendship, they agreed to part with it. On the right, you can see 2 sculptures that they acquired from Luce and Elica as well. In the center is Fist of Boccioni, lines of force lines of the Fist of Boccioni. And this is the original construction that Bala created that became later the emblem of the Futurist. It was used on stationery and so on as letterhead, and there are many sketches and drawings as well. And you can see him on the right with holding that sculpture, and also his tree is above him behind his head to the right. And you'll notice the medium here lines, so painted cardboard and wood, painted plywood. These are the original constructions. There were later versions made in metal and plastic, and that was really important to Malbin. They also became close with Benedetta Cappa Marinetti, the widow of the Futurist founder, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. From Benedetta, Malbin acquired many early Futurist works, including several paintings by Bala, 2 works by Luigi Russolo, and original editions of Futurist manifestos. You can see here on the left, Bala's proto-Futurist painting, The Stairway of Farewells, with that incredible view down the staircase, and then his later injection of Futurism from 1918. On the right, I'm just showing you a couple of the many, many documents, the correspondence between Marinetti and Malbin. In this case, she's listing the works that she has and the prices in 1956 at the bottom. And the telegram up top, she's saying that she's decided that she'd like to sell the Cara painting. Also from Benedetta Marinetti, Malbin acquired 3 Boccioni bronzes, which became some of her most prized works. So we have unique forms of continuity in space, anti-graceful, and development of a bottle in space, all 1913, cast 1950. Of unique forms, Malbin said, it is a construction of outward motion, uniting with inward motion, and creating a centrifugal power which holds the parts together, giving a work of great force and beauty. She was also struck by the fact that this was a cast that included it was cast including the base. So as this note from Benedetta Marinetti explains, this is the first complete or completo cast of this sculpture that shows the texture from the original plaster of that base. And this kind of detail that really excited and interested Malbin as she selected and acquired works. Of all the Futurists, it was Boccioni who became the most important to Malbin. She really came to feel that learning about him, collecting and preserving his work was her life's mission. Lydia and Harriet corresponded with and visited his sister, Raffaella Caligari Boccioni, in Verona, Italy, over a period of 5 years, learning about her brother and viewing the works in her collection. So she eventually sold them this self-portrait that you see here, and also her huge cache of her brother's works on paper, 260 drawings and 42 etchings, which she'd been reluctant to part with in fear that they would be dispersed. And so she really had to be sort of convinced that Malbin was dedicated to the work of her brother in order to part with them. You can see here they were shown at an exhibition at MoMA in 1961, and also many of them were cataloged in the accompanying catalog raisonné of the graphic work of Umberto Boccioni. You can also get a sense for how collecting across media and collecting in depth really illuminates aspects of, in this case, Boccioni's practice and the way that he was thinking about form and space at this time. So you can see on the left, Anti-Graceful, which is a bust of his mother, and then a selection of the many, many drawings. The top left is an etching, but otherwise drawings that he did, in which he is experimenting with fragmenting space and abstracting her form. Likewise, we see in these studies for the street pavers, the way that he moves from these life sketches of men at work to the kaleidoscopic arrangement of motion that you see in the final painting. By 1961, just 10 years after her first purchase of a Futurist work, Malbin had built one of the most significant collections of futurism in the country. For MoMA's Futurism Show, which was in 1961 and the first large US museum survey of the movement, curator Peter Seltz requested 18 works from the Winston Malbin collection. And you can see just a few of the works I've talked about here. The Bala here, and again in the back, and then Baccioni here. In addition to the works, Malbin was able to provide expertise and research guidance. She was involved in the planning of the show and also gave Seltz a 5-page list of her futurist contacts all over Europe, which facilitated his ability to acquire works for the collection and to get loans. At home in Birmingham, Harry and Lydia were tuned to how these new acquisitions connected with their collection as a whole. They installed works in the salon style, as you see here, with an eye to creating what they called an overall relationship across periods, artists, and media. And you're seeing the same wall from different angles, but also slightly different installations. So on the right, we have a few works that have been added. You can get a sense of how you have this sort of pattern of resonance across the works, and they start to create different tendencies and patterns emerge as the installation changes. This floor-to-ceiling installation also fit with a quality that Malbin saw in the works themselves. Of Bala's stairway, which you can see on the right-hand picture in the lower right, she said, quote, "You don't know where you're standing." And then she went on, "In futurism, you find yourself in the center of the picture. I've hung all of my pictures low, so you feel you're in the center." Here we have another comparison, this time of the living room. You'll notice also the addition of Malbin herself in the background at the lower right. Lydia and Harry's interest in collecting artist work across media and their openness to unconventional, non-canonical work really drove their collection. As they put it, "We select first and foremost that which definitely arrests us, that which contains elements and qualities that we believe will gain in interest as time goes on. The charming, the pretty, the decorative, the too appealing and popular we do not trust." By 1955, Malbin's collection had earned enough of a reputation that Barr himself, who Malbin had never contacted directly before then, came to visit, beginning a friendship that would last until the end of his life. And a letter after their meeting, he wrote, "It was really a great surprise to see a collection so fresh and unconventional in its contents." And 2 years later, he echoed those sentiments in another letter, saying, "I think you have one of the freshest and most unhackneyed collections of modern art in this country." After what would be their final visit to Baccioni's sister, 1959, Caligari Baccioni sent to Malbin's hotel in Verona a gift of Baccioni's palette. The accompanying note, which the innkeeper translated into English, described the gift as, quote, "in token of deepest friendship and for the warm enthusiasm," end quote, with which the collector had approached her brother's work. And Malbin later said of these visits with Caligari Baccioni that they were, quote, "some of the most touching experiences in our lives." So you're, of course, seeing that palette on the left, and then on the right, you can see a reproduction of the scrapbook page into which Malbin has put that original note from Caligari Baccioni, which is at the bottom right, and the innkeeper's translation up top, and also an explanation, a sort of narration of the significance of these items. As I described at the start of my talk, Malbin's interest in atypical works extended not only across traditional artistic media, but to posters, rugs, ceramics, greeting cards, doodles, and here, even palettes. These are all, as she put it, extensions of the artist's creativity. So in this framing, the artwork exists in a broader field of creative communication that the artist puts out into the world. And you can hope begin to see how this framing also makes that distinction between artwork, artifact, and archival document a little bit more blurry. Returning in closing to this picture from 1984, these two pictures, you can see that Malbin has framed the palette and installed it above Baccioni's self-portrait behind two of the bronzes that she purchased from Marinetti, creating a kind of Baccioni corner. In both pictures, she rests a hand on a Baccioni bronze. I read this gesture repeated across the photos rather insistently, not as a demonstration of the privilege of ownership that she can touch these works, although it of course is that, but as a reflection of Malbin's sense of deep personal connection to the artist through the work, that idea of the extension of the artist. As she put it, quote, "Because we have known the artist, the piece lives for us in a very intimate and magical way. The artist can continually speak to us through the object he has created." As these photos, and in particular that touch, help us to see, Malbin's sense of the collector as a link, as she put it, between the artist and the world was not merely a matter of the practicalities of sharing or exhibiting the work with a broader public. Instead, that idea really conveys her conviction about the deeply personal and relational experience of engaging with an original work of art. So I'm going to invite Stephanie back on to join us, and she's going to look at questions that people put into the chat, and you're welcome to add more. And we'll hopefully be able to answer them and discuss. So if you have questions or comments, please let us know.
Yeah, please put them in the chat. Thank you so much, Frances. I learned so much. And just, I was thinking a lot about, the artist-centered way that she collected, and your words about tracking the artists down, tracking their families down, engaging with the family members and building that kind of trust that you described, which is so important to collectors. So could you say a little bit more about her status as a woman collector and maybe the role of women in her story?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think it's important to remember just how groundbreaking she was in this era, and what the art world looked like for women. I didn't include it in my PowerPoint, but one of the things I found was in the archives was an invitation from the Scarab Club, which is a Detroit arts club, inviting her to join as its class of inaugural women members in 1962. So, this is many, many decades into her work as a collector. Similarly, when their collection was included in a compendium called Great Private Collections, I think around the same time, it was listed as the Harry Louis Winston collection. So, there are just real ways in which she was sort of, had to make space, I suppose. But I think even beyond that, one of the things that really struck me about, and this is, is really just overwhelmingly abundantly clear in the archives, is the friendships that she formed with other, women art dealers, Peggy Guggenheim, Rose Freed, and then in particular with the wives, the daughters, the sisters of artists, who really acted as sort of like de facto, estate managers for the work of the futurists. So I think there's interesting things to say there about that kind of those social relationships and the kinship and the kind of cultivation of these deep relationships over time that really was often done and maintained by women. I will say she did not collect many women artists. So, there were a few, Nevelson, for example, but not otherwise a great number.
Yeah, thank you. And we have some good questions, maybe putting two together. Where's her collection today? Did she donate or sell it? And also related to that, what was her relationship to the DIA?
Yeah, both really great questions. So she had thought about donating her collection throughout her life. She was, as you might imagine, courted by museum directors all over the country. And in the end, she left most of her work to her family. And she gave upon her death in 1989, she bequeathed her most important Boccioni works to the Metropolitan Museum. So they now have most of the works that I showed you, a few works to the Whitney. And then throughout her life, she did periodically give works to the DIA in Detroit. And one of the things that concerned her about donating her collection sort of earlier in her career to the Detroit Institute of Art was whether or not it would be basically, financially able to care for it. So there was uncertainty about the future of the museum and the status of the city financially. So to answer the question of where is the collection now, it is now largely dispersed. Some of the works is a group of works that are still with Malbin's family, with her descendants. And then in 1990, most of the works, the majority of the collection was sold at an auction at Sotheby's in New York, and now it's in private and public collections across the US and Europe.
Great. And the backstory, someone's asking, let's see. Oh, quickly, before we get into that, just a quick question also, the archives at the Beinecke, and why did Yale get the archives?
This is another good question. So one of the things I didn't touch on is how much of a, she was a scholar, but she was also really invested in supporting scholarship. And throughout her time in Michigan and then in New York, she welcomed seminars, classes, and so on to use the collection, and entire seminars were taught around the collection. So that's something she did with Yale as well. And the Beinecke itself has a really amazing collection of futurist manifestos and papers already. So I think it made sense in that respect. There was also, and I don't have the date in front of me now, but within, toward the end of Malbin's life, but within her lifetime, Yale organized a series of seminars and a big exhibition on futurism that made use of a lot of her collection as well, and her archives in particular. So I think my understanding is that's sort of part of where the relationship was formed.
And can you, Frances, we have a question about the backstory to collecting the Blonde Negress and the play that her husband wrote about the experience.
Yeah, so they wrote, Harry and Lydia wrote a one-act play, I think it's one act, based on this experience, which gives you a sense of how memorable it was and what a character Brancusi was. And so, Lydia and Harry are in it, as is Claire, their friend, and Brancusi, of course. And I think this, sort of speaks to the warmth and humor with which also Lydia and Harry really approached their relationships with artists, and some of the, strange situations they ended up in. I think Harry especially sort of contributed. He was an integral part of collecting, but he was not the driving force, and he often, I think, played this role of sort of being the bemused spectator, perhaps, or adding a little bit of sort of social humor to the occasions.
Thanks. So let's see. Do you have any idea how she came to focus on Italian early futurism? Did she ever consider Russian futurism, for instance?
No, I don't think so. And I think it was, as I just briefly alluded to, I think there was a little bit of a sort of, combination of something she'd already been interested in. So something she was this quality of newness around motion, representing, as she put it, I think, poetic expressions of our technical age, which she'd sort of were already in the works that she was collecting before she even really started to focus on futurism. And then there was this moment with the 1949 show at MoMA where she had the opportunity to really see a lot of works, albeit through the catalog of the early Italian futurists, and read Barr's essay. And I think that there was this sort of campaign in a way on the part of the Italian government to kind of rehabilitate Italian art after the war and send it abroad. So it was a moment when people were paying attention to Italian modern art in particular. And then I think she really, identified it as a kind of niche. So, it was harder for her to collect first-rate works for a lot of the other movements because many of them are already in collections. Whereas with the early futurists, she had this opportunity. And Rose Freed, I think, said to her, Severini is still alive. He's the only one of the early futurists still living. Severini is still living. Go find him. So it really, I think, appealed to that sense of, that collecting art was not just about going to a gallery and buying a picture you liked. It was about journeying to a place, knowing a person, knowing his family, and really forming this close relationship.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking about the questions about the Beinecke archives because it certainly was the way that, this whole project kind of started, the Beinecke archives and thinking about them. And I was going to ask you a question about how did maybe the archives also direct your research in a certain way. I do want to say for everybody on the call that these archives are open for research, and the Beinecke has a very good, they will digitize records if you send a query to them as well. We hope to get one of our Beinecke colleagues on here, but she was out of town. But maybe you could say just a little bit more about the archives, Frances. And
yeah, I mean, I hope, it's hard to show archival material in a presentation like this. It's really just, the scope is extraordinary. And I think for me, I worked a lot on contemporary artists whose archives don't even exist yet, or an artist where, you go to 5 archives and maybe you find a few things here and there. So it was a new experience to just have this huge, rich archive and to be able to immerse myself in it. And, I still feel that I barely scratched the surface. I think one of the things I kept thinking about was how, how sort of ahead of her time she was in her sense of of the value of collecting these records, keeping these records, and also keeping, not just sort of basic documentation, but keeping records that provided more of a kind of context and understanding of the artist's ideas. And this is something that museums do now often with acquisitions. They send, questionnaires asking for background information about works. And I, know that through museum work. So I kept thinking about, my gosh, what would it be like to have this sort of rich documentation that accompanied individual works.
yeah, I think, just speaking from the gallery and the work that our curatorial team does, the kind of collector's voice and the intellectual engagement that you can find from these materials. And so in our curatorial files for individual works of art, that's such an important part of building the picture, building a much bigger framework and a kind of personal history almost for a picture. But in this case, I just think I've been so amazed at the scope of her archives and the ability to kind of tenaciously continue that focus. That's very unusual for collectors, and I think really speaks to her engagement with the personal side as well. Somebody was asking about why were some artists reluctant to sell their art because of course they want to survive, and that's part of what we think about.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to generalize, but I think that some artists, they were older, they were more reclusive, they liked, maybe they had a few people they sold to, but they didn't sell to dealers. And so I think in some cases, and this is where you come back to really the legwork of what collecting looked like too, right? It was like, you meet with somebody and you get the address of somebody else, and then you travel to that little village, and then it turns out he's not there because he's visiting his daughter in Rome, and then you go there. And so I think some of it was just, practical sort of, people being far flung, but also just, older artists, in particular with the families of, the women families of the early futurists. I think also there was a wariness, about what, whether these works would be, well taken care of, will they be sold again? And in the example of Baccioni's sister, it was all she had left. Her brother was killed in World War I, and this was what she had left of her brother. And so it was an incredibly personal thing to let people see it, but also, of course, most importantly, to part with it. So, she really had to be convinced that this was somebody who was dedicated to her brother's legacy.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we have a few more questions. It is 6:30, but maybe just quickly, I think you mentioned somebody's asking Mr. Winston's profession. I think you mentioned he was a
He was an
lawyer.
attorney. Yeah, he was an attorney. And then her second husband, Barnett Malbin, was an orthodontist.
And they moved to New York
So they moved to New York in 1973, 74. And I think, I don't know a lot about the personal reasons for that, but I think in some ways, it was time for a change. She'd been in Detroit for her whole life. Her art world was increasingly in New York. And I think she also wanted to be close to the museums there. So they moved in right basically around the time of that the big Guggenheim show.
Yeah, it was, it's amazing to see those shows and how the building of modernism in America through collecting at the time. This was a great profile. Thank you so much, Frances. Thank you again to Lydia, who I know is on here tonight, for all of your guidance and your family's guidance in this project.
This is to clarify Lydia Robinson, who's the granddaughter of Lydia Winston.
Yes, thank you, Frances. And again, the Beinecke collection of archives is here and it's searchable on the web. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Frances, for your work in illuminating talk. And we look forward to hearing more. As I mentioned at the beginning, Frances's article will come out in the Yale Art Gallery Bulletin, and she'll also have an article in the Yale Art Gallery's magazine, which you can sign up for online.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And I'll just say also thanks to everybody here for listening and for your great questions. And if anyone, for those of you who are art historians, definitely go and delve into the archives, because there's really, they're extraordinary resources.
Great. Thank you. Have a good evening.